Now it's an honor to introduce the next keynote speaker, our fourth of the day. So coming onto the stage now is Admiral Paul Zukunft. As he assumed the duties of the 25th Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard on May 30th of 2014. He leads the oldest continuous seagoing service and the largest component of the Department of Defense. Joining him for this keynote discussion is David Martin. David has been with CBS News National Security. He is their national security correspondent since 1993, covering the Pentagon and the State Department, and in that capacity, he's reported on virtually every major defense, intelligence, and international affairs initiative, effort, and issue around the globe. Please welcome David Martin and Admiral Zukunft.
Thank you. I've got to tell CBS to update my bio. I've been working there since 1983, not 93, but which just makes me older than I want to admit. As the national security correspondent for CBS, I have to begin by admitting that I don't follow day-to-day developments in the Arctic simply because it's one of the few regions in the world that is currently free of conflict. And there's enough conflict elsewhere to keep me busy. It occurs to me that the Arctic is somewhat like space was in the 1950s. Everybody realizes its potential significance, but there hasn't yet been, for the public at least, a galvanizing event like Sputnik to sort of concentrate the collective talents of the United States on a new realm such as the Arctic. So will there be a Sputnik-like event in the Arctic, or is change in the Arctic evolutionary enough so that we're not going to miss out on what's going to happen up there, whatever it turns out to be? We've obviously got just the right person to ask those questions of, but since I spend all my days in the Pentagon, I want to ask my first questions from a military perspective. The Navy is due to come out fairly shortly with an update of its Arctic roadmap, and the last one was published in 2014. And it read, the region is expected to remain a low-threat security environment where nations resolve differences peacefully. Now, obviously, a lot has happened since 2014, particularly in U.S.-Russian relations. So I'd like to begin by asking you, Admiral, does the Arctic remain a low-threat environment where differences will be settled peacefully?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. And so when you ask those questions, it really goes into the planning paradigm of what we would call assumptions. And if you look at where the Navy is being pulled in the national military strategy today around the world, it's at some point in time you have to manage risk. And what is the lowest threshold of risk? And I would say right now for the Navy, there are two places where the Navy can afford to go at risk. One is in the Arctic, and the other is in the Western Hemisphere. I met with President Varela from Panama yesterday. And in fact, next week I'll be meeting with the leaders of Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama again. And they're saying we need more United States Coast Guard off our coast because people are dying in our countries from violent crime, because of drug flows leaving South America, destined for the United States. So it's primarily a Coast Guard mission. So you've got the same paradigm as we look at the Arctic. The assumption is today it's benign. But if you spend any time up there, and I want to recognize former President of Iceland, I was at an Arctic summit, and I met this debonair gentleman with no security detail, and I introduced myself, and he's the President of Iceland. He then addressed, this was hosted in Anchorage, Alaska, and I think the year was about 2012, 2013, and basically admonished the United States for losing strategic focus on what is happening in the Arctic. And so if you're living here, the word polar acceleration probably doesn't resonate with you. It was only in 1979 when NASA put satellites in outer space that really started looking at sea ice retreat. And so that data point is very limited in nature, and we can certainly measure the rise in ocean temperature, and what is filling that vacuum right now is human activity. So what is that activity going to look like in 20 years? The change, I would say, if you use evolutionary and Sputnik in the same sentence, a Sputnik is a black swan event. What if it's the cruise ship's Crystal Serenity? It runs aground on an uncharted object, and you have the equivalent of the Titanic sinking. That was in 1912. To this day, the Coast Guard continues to fly the International Ice Patrol after that horrific loss of life of a cruise ship. So we have more of that activity filling the vacuum. Rich oil and gas reserves are up there. Today, oil trades at $42 a barrel. So if you look at oil and gas, about 33% of the world's gas, about 13% of the world's oil is up in the Arctic. Maybe it's locked in right now, but is it going to be that way for perpetuity, or does oil reach a price point where it's now profitable to harvest again? And for the United States, we have explored the extent of our outer continental shelf. It's the size of the state of Texas. And about half of all of those oil and gas reserves are really within our sovereign rights to exploit. But we have not ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. I think we really need to start there and abide by rules of behavior by ratifying the Law of the Sea Convention, state what is rightfully ours, and recognizing there are significant competing claims in the Arctic, to include Russia claiming all the way up to the North Pole. So how is that going to look like in 10 or 15 years today? So you've got an assumption that it's a low threat. But what do you have, a Sputnik event, and you can't evolve quick enough, and then you find yourself on the strategic sidelines as we've abdicated a region where there may be contesting challenges in this domain.
So we've got about 15 minutes, and I want to take as many questions as possible from the audience. So while everybody's lining up behind the mics, let me just follow up with that. What is the Coast Guard's current capability to do search and rescue in the Arctic?
Yeah. So I'll take you back 40 years. And 40 years ago, you would have seen Ensign Zukunft sitting here. At that point in time, we had 7 icebreakers in our national fleet. Today, we have 2. And one of those was a brand new ship 40 years ago, and now it's a 40-year-old ship. It's as old as I am. Actually, it's older. I got a head start. And then we have a medium icebreaker. So this is an area where we have not paid attention to in terms of where do we invest as an Arctic nation to be able to be a strategic player in this domain. And quite frankly, David, we have not made those investments, and the time is long overdue.
So where did the U.S. sort of lose lock on the Arctic? If they had those icebreakers 40 years ago, but now we're down to this one old 40-year-old one and a mothballed one.
It really begins with what was our strategic framework for the Arctic, and it wasn't until several years ago where we actually codified a strategic framework for the Arctic region. We had already written a strategy for the Coast Guard, but if you live in this town, you can write strategies. They're like dead cats. You can swing them around and they don't hit anything. It better connect to something. So in this case, we want to make sure that we connect to national policy in the Arctic. So the epiphany was really, we have an awakening at the national level that we have got to pay attention to what's happening in the Arctic. And it's not just about scientific support. It is a domain that has opened up. And what is our strategic approach? Is it going to be the next military campaign? Or is it going to be working among Coast Guards, looking at rising sea levels, northern migrations of fish stocks, where we have today 3 billion people subsist on protein as their source of fish. China has a distant water fleet of 20,000 ships, will go anywhere in the world to harvest fish. Now, we have a moratorium not to fish up there. That's a great piece of paper, but that's all that it is. So if we've got paper policy with nothing to back it up, we are long overdue to put our best foot forward and actually have the means to implement some of these policies.
Okay. Do we have somebody at the mic there?
Admiral, my name is Peter Humphrey. I'm an intel analyst and a former diplomat. I'm wondering if things are progressing in such a way that we will reinvigorate hydrophone arrays in Arctic waters, and maybe even look toward a port that can handle submarine operations in those waters. Or are those just pie in the sky wastes of money? What's your opinion on those investments?
That'd probably be a good question for the CNO to answer, especially with our submarine fleet. And by the way, I did call him Saturday as soon as I heard about the USS Fitzgerald tragedy. When I called him, he was packing his bags to be out there to grieve with those families. But another point, if you want to talk about, remotely operated vehicles, about 5% of the Arctic, and maybe it's slightly less, is charted to what we would call 21st century standards. And I approached Google with this challenge of how do we map and survey the entire Arctic region as sea ice retreats, because many of these waters have not been surveyed. And if they have, you're dating back to the era of Captain Cook. You've got seismic activity, the seabed shifts, and so there's a lot of unknown out there. So first I would look at, what is the survey data? And this is to our colleagues from Iceland. I was on the Icelandic Coast Guard vessel Thor. Thor, that's a great name, by the way. It's a sea god. First of all, the captain of the ship has got over 58 years of sea duty serving in the Arctic. He's an old salt. But I looked at the datum on his charts, and they were dated 1912. When Ernest Shackleton was hanging out in the Endurance. And so it really underscores the fact that we don't know what we don't know in terms of survey data. And so if I were to place a priority the first is, the mapping, the survey work that needs to happen up in the Arctic. I would conjecture that our submarine fleet, they pass one track line to the next. We didn't hit anything. This is a safe route. But you have more and more activity going up there. And so that would be the first place I would look at. And then obviously, a deep water port is lacking. So if this becomes the next Suez Canal, the shortcut to Europe between Asia, what is lacking is a deep water port that can do intermodal work, especially within the containerized fleet. And so we're working with the Army Corps of Engineers. In fact, we're required to look at potentials for deep water ports up in Alaska. There are two in particular that may be appealing to the commercial and military fleets, Port Clarence and also in Nome, Alaska. But we're doing a study with the Army Corps of Engineers on that right now, mostly on the commercial, on the Coast Guard side, but not so much on the submarine front.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I can give you the Navy's answer to your question, because I have it here from their roadmap for the Arctic from 2014. They said there will be low demand for additional naval involvement in the Arctic. Therefore, current naval capabilities are sufficient to meet near-term operational needs. Doesn't sound like they're looking to open a sub-base in the Arctic. Do we have another question there?
I have a question
I'm
over
sorry.
here. Yeah, Augustus Salzona, a strong, loyal supporter of the President of the United States. The question is this, in light of renewed interests and, I guess, priority in terms of the international war on drugs, or war on drugs here in the U.S., and in light of the probability that as the Coast Guard and our other forces start cutting off the lines of supply of drugs into this country, is there a possibility, or a reasonable possibility, that the drug industry will be able to find other routes, such as going north or coming through the north?
Yeah, great question. We had a high-level meeting in Miami just a week ago, from Thursday, talking about some of the very challenges. So it's all, I would view this as counterinsurgency. In this case, the insurgency, it's not an ideology. It's all about greed and money. And where do you get the best return on investment? So here's the business plan. If you are a coca farmer in Colombia, you can produce a kilo of cocaine, and I won't even get into the opioid because that's even more concerning, for $2,000. You can sell that in New York for $20,000. You can sell it in New York for $80,000. You can sell it in Europe for $200,000. I don't know what the market is up in Alaska, but I'm not sure how many people have that kind of disposable income, that can pay, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 for a kilo. Or do you go the other way and say for $10 you can get a hit of heroin and then laced with fentanyl? So the real problem for the United States is we try to get in front of the flow, is what are we doing behind to deal with the demand signal that we've got in the United States? And that, to me, is the number one problem. I met with the president of Honduras last week, and I said, we're caught in a crossroad. I'm right next to the number one producer of drugs, and on the other side is the number one consumer of drugs, and that is the United States of America. And so when we look at violent crime and why people send their children with human smugglers to take refuge in the United States, we bear a burden of responsibility for all of that is happening because it is our consumption that really is what is driving this train right now. So is the potential there? If there's a dollar to be had, absolutely. I've been out to Little Diomede several years ago, and I saw residents out there that were laced out on methamphetamine. There are no meth labs out there, so there's a means to an end, and it really is about this profit incentive of people will sell their souls to apply their trade.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Admiral. Steve Keating from Georgetown University Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. First, a comment and one question. The comment is the great value the Coast Guard does. You talked about the Sputnik event. There's so much that people do not see what the Coast Guard does in terms of preventing hazards at sea. So great kudos to the Coast Guard for having such a systematic and an intelligent-based safety of life at sea program through your publications like Proceedings, et cetera. So here's my question. You mentioned the need for surveys. You mentioned the large area the Coast Guard has to patrol. Is there any thought of perhaps partnering with the indigenous peoples of Alaska to kind of leverage an Alaskan auxiliary for search and rescue and or disaster prevention in the American Arctic?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and we're really at the threshold of that. So right now we're in the process of standing up a squadron of H-60 helicopters in Kotzebue. We were doing that out of Barrow, Alaska several years ago when Shell had over 22 ships, several thousand oil workers going back and forth. And it would be perceived as a little bit disingenuous on the part of the Coast Guard of we're only there to save oil workers and big oil. Meanwhile, we've got these umiaks are having to go further and further offshore as sea ice retreats to get their quota of mammals for subsistence living. So we're already out there already. We have a strong outreach with the indigenous communities. We made the mistake of everyone should wear a life jacket. We gave them bright orange life vests. Well, if you want to repel what you're trying to eat, put on an orange life vest. We gave them white ones. And simple messages, reaching out to the schools as well, that kids don't float. And obviously, I mean, this is very frigid temperature. But we're trying to move a culture along. In fact, even when they looked at more humane ways of taking a whale. In fact, a whale gives itself to the community. Initially, airlines wouldn't carry the explosive projectile to distribute to the community. So we said, hey, we'll put it in our C-130s. But we have an aggressive outreach program with the program. So I'll share you this story. In August, I went out up to Greenland, and I went up there with Senator Angus King and two world-renowned climatologists, and we went out to the Jakobshavn Glacier. But we met with the Inuit tribe there and the elders, and they said the glacier hadn't moved in the last millennium, but in 5 years, Jakobshavn has retreated over 25 miles. In fact, on our flight out there, it looked like the unbridled Colorado River in the United States, except instead of flowing into the ocean, it goes down a deep hole called a moulin. Disco Bay, that would be frozen year-round, is now open year-round, and what they would use as a conveyance with sled teams is now requires a boat. So when you ask them what is happening in their world, the world is changing very fast. So much as sea ice retreats, Earth is exposed, rare metals exist, and China has taken a very keen interest in those rare metals. So a lot of this is happening, not evolutionary in Darwinian terms, but it is happening almost in Sputnik terms.
So we're almost out of time, but let's take one more question here.
Okay. My name is Jessica Shadian, CIC and Bill Graham Center from University of Toronto. My question comes back to this flying dead cat scenario I can't seem to get out of my head. But it's kind of going back to like how do you get kind of the financial ear of the White House aside from perhaps the Serenity sinking. And I'm wondering if there's anything, if maybe you can comment perhaps on the idea of strengthening collaboration with Canadian Coast Guard and also your thoughts on the Arctic Coast Guard Forum and how that might serve as elevating the role of the Coast Guard in the Arctic.
Yeah, I would just categorize that our relationship with my dear friend Jeff Hutchinson, who's just taken over as commissioner after Jody Thomas, we have had a long-standing relationship with our Canadian partners. In fact, when we're doing survey work up in the Arctic with the Louis and with the Coast Guard Carter Healy, we do exchange of information, exchange of shipwriters, full transparency of some of the survey data taking place. We're looking at the Diefenbacher design. Is that something that we can bring in-house and then modify into a heavy icebreaker within the United States Coast Guard? On the Great Lakes, we have an agreement there. If one of our icebreakers breaks down, Canada will help break out our ports, and vice versa. If one of theirs, we will help them as well. So complete synergy with Canada as we look at all things Arctic. I would say the biggest challenge we have right now, and I'll go back 7 years ago. I was the on-scene commander for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And with all of the science that we have in the Gulf of Mexico, we didn't have enough information to know whether it was prudent to use more dispersants to prevent oil from coming into the wetlands and what the effect would be throughout the food chain in the Gulf of Mexico. I would say we were light years ahead of what we knew about Bethnics and science in the Gulf of Mexico, and we're still just scratching the surface up in the high latitudes. The sharing of information, scientific information, that really doesn't have the sovereignty stamp on it. It was in everybody's collective interest. So I would just continue to advocate, and I know the Arctic Council is advocating for that as well. And I'll just close by saying, the Arctic Council is really more policy, focused, but then how do you implement policy? And that is really through the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. And so when Canada handed off the chair to the United States, we saw that as an opportunity to really move out and create this Arctic Coast Guard Forum. And can we fill this vacuum of the Arctic, first and foremost, with Coast Guards of the Arctic nations and not make this the next, Battle of Midway scenario? And that's really the direction that we're trying to move in right now, but really in lockstep with Canada. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Admiral. I think that is the end of our Q&A session here, and we're going to go to a panel now. Is that right? Okay.